Good day. This is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you on November 21st, 2025 for Reason to Resist from Montreal, Canada. This week, and as we reported on Reason to Resist, the UN Security Council has betrayed the Palestinian people by adopting a resolution that endorsed Donald Trump's criminal and fraudulent peace plan for Gaza. That resolution, Resolution 2803, is by no means the first time that the UN Security Council has stabbed Arab and Muslim peoples in the back. Another notorious example of the Security Council's contempt for the human rights and interests of Arab and Muslim peoples is United Nations Security Council Resolution 1973. Adopted on March 17, 2011, Security Council Resolution 1973 approved a no-fly zone over Libya. This led directly to NATO's destruction of the once prosperous North African nation. Few people are as knowledgeable about NATO's campaign in Libya as Canadian researcher and author Owen Schalk. A new book by Owen examines the role of Canada, a NATO member, in the destruction of Libya. And you can see the cover here on the screen. The book, entitled Targeting Libya, How Canada Went from Building Public Works to Bombing an Oil-Rich Country and Creating Chaos for Its Citizens, has been newly released, I believe, by Lorimer Publishing. Owen's work, by the way, focuses on domestic and foreign policy. His articles have been published by Monthly Review, Protean Magazine, and Canadian Dimension. And he joins us today from the Canadian province of Manitoba. Thank you for coming on to Reason to Resist, Owen.
Great. Thanks for having me, Dimitri.
So, Owen, I'd like to begin with UN Security Council Resolution 1973, which, as I mentioned, authorized the no-fly zone over Libya. That resolution was just one of several UN Security Council resolutions that took punitive action against Libya's government. And of course, a lot of negative things were constantly being said about the Muammar Gaddafi government by Western regimes in the lead up to the destruction of Libya. Could you talk to us about the various actions taken by the Security Council that set the stage for the NATO bombardment of Libya and the rationale that they articulated for those actions?
Absolutely. As you say, this week with the UN Security Council resolution on Palestine, we saw that the UNSC, our global institutions in general, are clearly deeply flawed. This was a complete selling out of the Palestinian people to U.S. imperialism, which we saw, a similar dynamic play out in 2011 with Libya. And the background to this was that in February 2011, these uprisings started in Libya, specifically centered around Benghazi. And from there, the protests initially related to the arrest of a lawyer in Libya who was representing families of people killed in the Abu Salim prison massacre. And from there, the protests avalanched into this wider expression of anti-government sentiment, not only about Abu Salim, but about a variety of other things. And very quickly, these violent extremist groups sort of took the reins of the anti-government protest movement. And, it needs to be said, if these protests were ever peaceful, they quickly became armed and they targeted police, they burned buildings, they tried to seize military weapons and equipment, and government forces responded, and these clashes began. And very quickly, the anti-Gaddafi opposition formed into the National Transitional Council, or the NTC, which created a parallel government. And it was comprised of many actually defectors from the Libyan government. And we can talk maybe about some of the rifts that had opened up in the Libyan government in previous years. So by the end of February, the UNSC passed Resolution 1970, which imposed sanctions on Libya and called for an arms embargo on Libya. So it said no weapons should be allowed into Libya to arm any side in the conflict. Importantly, NATO did not abide by the arms embargo. They shipped weapons to the Libyan rebels. France and Italy did this. The U.S. did this. Canada did this later in March by allowing weapons through the port of Misrata to the rebel-held city there. But then the UNSC really got involved on March 17th when they passed Resolution 1973, which imposed a no-fly zone on Libya. And they said that this was to prevent the Libyan government from committing atrocities against its citizens. Of course, the UNSC completely ignored the fact that the anti-Gaddafi uprising was also committing atrocities, including targeting Black Libyans for torture and for lynchings. And also importantly, actually, that Resolution 1973 did not authorize the overthrow of the Libyan government. And it explicitly forbade boots on the ground in Libya, which again, NATO powers, including Canada, flagrantly violated by actually dispatching special forces to the Libyan battlefields. And of course, when this happened, the UNSC didn't comment on it and certainly didn't act on it. And then with the passing of this resolution 1973 on March 17th, the US launched Operation Odyssey Dawn with the backing of NATO. Canada deployed 7 aircraft, CF-18 fighters as part of the mission, as well as 2 tanker aircraft, 2 military bases in Italy, which it should be said is Libya's former colonial overlord. And from there, the NATO planes just started bombing. They struck Libyan government ammo depots. They directly bombed Libyan government soldiers and tanks, government bunkers. And right away, as powers started to bomb, NATO, African countries warned that NATO attacks were greatly empowering the Islamist insurgencies in the region. And these insurgencies had been the backbone of the anti-Gaddafi movement for years, particularly a group called the LIFG, or the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, which was responsible for an assassination attempt against Gaddafi in 1996, which whistleblower Dolores Kane said was partly funded by the British MI6. So very quickly we saw with the NATO attack, which was, the UN Resolution 1973 was used as the pretext for it, we see Africa completely sidelined. African leaders are warning what the effects of this attack will be. There's a report in late March that Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb had, in the chaos of NATO's war, seized weapons from a Libyan government stockpile. And after that, Chad's president Idris Deby said that AQIM was becoming the best equipped army in the region. The foreign minister of Niger said that the region had turned into a powder keg and that Al-Qaeda's impact around the region was growing as these stolen weapons were circulating. But NATO kept bombing. And by late March of that year, hundreds of thousands of people had fled Libya to escape the fighting and the aerial bombardment. And the African Union kept trying to negotiate a path to peace, but they were totally sidelined by NATO, which used the UNSC resolution as a justification for doing so. And at a certain point, the chairman of the AU Commission said that nobody had talked to them at all. Nobody had consulted the African Union, and the African Union had been totally sidelined, despite the fact that the African Union represents all 55 countries on the African continent. So again, we can connect this to what we see going on in Palestine now, where the will of the people on the ground is totally ignored, and the powers that sit at the UN Security Council don't do anything really. Well, in fact, they actively work to undermine the will of the people on the ground. And importantly, I think when UNSC Resolution 1973 passed, Russia and China did not veto it. And again, we see that with the recent resolution on Palestine, Russia and China also did not veto it, which raises the question of how committed these powers actually are to confronting the United States and US imperialism. Of course, Russia is actively confronting NATO and US imperialism right now in Ukraine. China is being encircled in all kinds of ways by US imperialism. But if these powers don't realize that collaborating with US imperialism in the long run won't get them anything, they'll only continue to face more and more aggression. If they don't realize this, well, then they're going to continue to be complicit in horrible actions of this kind, whether it's in Palestine or in Libya or in other places. I could also now just talk a little bit about Libyan history and the figure of Muammar Gaddafi, if you think that would be fair, because I think there's so many misunderstandings about his government, especially in the West.
I definitely want to come back to that, but before we leave that, go to that subject, You said something interesting about how NATO governments were using that resolution, I believe it was 1973, to justify their ongoing bombardment of Libya. I've seen in the anti-imperialist media this week, there are people like me and Craig Mohiber, former UN human rights lawyer, and many others, particularly people from the legal profession, who have been very critical of this resolution that passed on Monday and the failure of Russia and China to veto it. And there's in the anti-imperialist alternative media, there are many people whose tendency is to kind of reflexively defend the governments of Russia and China. And I understand completely, that tendency in a world of U.S. hegemony and all the horrors that has perpetrated. But the argument that a lot of them are putting out is, well, this is just a piece of paper, and at the end of the day, it's not going to change the reality on the ground. But I think that the lesson of Libya is that these actions at the UN Security Council end up being employed by the perpetrators of these crimes as a justification for what they're doing, and that they do actually have a very important impact on the public discourse around the subject, and that's exactly why, for example, the United States government, I should say, invests so much political capital in getting these resolutions passed at the United Nations, just as Trump did with respect to the Palestine resolution, and just as the U.S. government did with respect to these Libya-related resolutions. Do you think we should anticipate that what is going to happen, just based on the lesson of Libya, we should anticipate that Western governments are now going to use this resolution that China and Russia did not veto on Monday to justify all manner of crimes in the occupied Gaza Strip?
Oh, I think it's very likely. And, as we saw with Libya, and as you say, the lesson of Libya is that these resolutions actually are not just pieces of paper, and that they can be used as pretexts and justifications for all kinds of atrocities, all kinds of horrific actions. Libya was absolutely shredded apart by the United States and by NATO, using a UNSC resolution as the justification. Today, Libya has no sovereignty whatsoever. The central state has been destroyed. There are a variety of foreign powers in Libya right now, backing various sides in the conflict in order to further their own interests. So Libya was once a very sovereign state, a very independent state, within the African context, and a highly developed state. And we see now, that this war, this NATO intervention, it had occurred 14 years ago. And we can see now the effects of it, where you have Libya effectively partitioned between two rival governments that are backed by various foreign countries. We see that a country that once had free education and healthcare, a highly developed economy, today, poverty and food insecurity have risen sharply. Agricultural production has plummeted. So many people have fled the country because of what NATO did there. So I don't agree with the notion that these UN Security Council resolutions are purely pieces of paper that don't matter, and that actually it didn't matter that Russia and China didn't veto it, because the effects on the ground will be minimal. I don't think that's true. And I certainly sympathize with the tendency to defend Russia and China against US imperialism and NATO. I was just in China last week, actually, and it's an extremely remarkable country. But again, we can have a nuanced view. We can look with a clear eye at the things that Russia and China do around the world, or the domestic developments in those countries. We can also criticize when they do things that, as anti-imperialists, we don't agree with.
Yeah.
And Palestine, I think, is the litmus test for movements, for parties, for governments around the world. And if they don't back Palestine, well, I think they're being extremely misguided in their view of the world, because Palestine is at the forefront of the anti-imperialist movement right now. So if a government somewhere in the world opposes imperialism, well, they need to stand with Palestine no matter what. And it was definitely concerning that Russia and China did not in this case.
Yeah, and so I want to talk about, the whole idea of a nuanced view in the context of Muammar Gaddafi. And by the way, I just want to stress, uh, perhaps it doesn't need to be said, but I'm going to say it anyways, that at the very moment that the UN Security Council was taking these Western-backed actions against Libya uh, on the basis of democracy and human rights and international law, the United States, Britain, and other Western countries were perpetrating war crimes and international legal crimes in Iraq and Afghanistan, amongst other parts of the Arab and Muslim world. At that very moment, I believe Obama was carrying out a murderous drone campaign in which he was extrajudicially assassinating on a weekly basis various people in the Arab and Muslim world who had been convicted of no crime, in some cases not even charged with a crime by the United States government, let alone convicted. So I think it's important to remember that context. It certainly is one that is applicable here as well. But the line that was used at the time was that Muammar Gaddafi, he's been in power for decades. He's a brutal dictator. And his government does perpetrate significant human rights abuses. What do you think the reality of Muammar Gaddafi's rule in Libya was?
Well, I don't think we can talk about Muammar Gaddafi, the man, without understanding the context from which he emerged. And Libya has an extremely long and storied history going back to antiquity. And one of the threads that we can follow through much of that history is the thread of foreign occupation. The territories that now make up Libya were occupied at various times throughout their history by foreign powers, whether it's the Roman Empire or the Ottoman Empire, the Italian colonization, and then the US domination from the end of World War II until 1969, which was the year that the revolutionary coup led by Muammar Gaddafi overthrew the monarchy of King Idris and established the Revolutionary Command Council. And I think for Libya's more modern history, we can begin in 1911, which was when Italy invaded Libya and took it from Ottoman control and began a colonial project of its own in Libya. And the Italians at the time, they were concerned with overpopulation, so they began to transfer unemployed Italians into Libya to work as agricultural colonists there. And the Libyan colony imported from Italy almonds, olives, fruit trees, and vineyards with the aim of transforming Libya into an agricultural resource colony, like other colonies occupied by European empires at the time. And this colonization process was very brutal, and it only became more brutal after Benito Mussolini took power in 1922. The new fascist government in Italy, they confiscated Libyan lands that they described as quote unquote uncultivated, and they launched a total war of annihilation against Libya's anti-colonial resistance, which also involved confiscating lands that belonged to the families and the kinship networks of Libyan anti-colonial fighters. And the Italian war against the Libyan resistance was vicious, and it's little known in the West, especially the fact that they built concentration camps in Libya in which thousands and thousands of Libyans were killed. And it was in this context that Omar al-Mukhtar, the famous anti-colonial fighter known as the Lion of the Desert, about whom a film was made in 1981 with Libyan government financing, he rose up against Italian forces, and he was captured and executed in a concentration camp in 1931. And so this was the situation in Libya until the end of World War II. And again, something a lot of people don't know is that the Second World War had a devastating impact on an already devastated Libya. Landmines were strewn across the landscape, across deserts, across agricultural lands. Cities like Tobruk and Benghazi suffered under many air raids. And once the Italian Empire fell, Libya came into Allied occupation. So the US opened a military base in Libya called the Wheelus Air Base. The British and French were involved, trying to establish their own spheres of influence in Libya. But eventually, the matter of Libyan independence came before the UN, and in 1951, the UN granted Libya formal independence under King Idris, who established essentially a puppet government in which the true power makers were, of course, the US and Britain, but mainly the US.
Mm-hmm.
So then when Libya entered this era of formal independence, what it really was neocolonial subjugation to the Western powers. And at the time that it achieved formal independence, Libya was very, very poor, possibly one of the poorest countries on the planet. But it was this very large landmass, strategically situated in North Africa, with a large Mediterranean coast and borders that pushed down into Central Africa. So the Western powers viewed this as a very important area of potential influence in Africa, especially as an increasing amount of African peoples were demanding their dignity and their liberation from European colonialism.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, oil was discovered in the 1950s. And this was a time in history when oil was becoming increasingly important for industrializing economies. There was what was called the Red Line Agreement in 1928, the Anglo-American Petroleum Agreement in 44. Then you had FDR and Ibn Saud on the USS Quincy, where they strike the agreement that the US will support the Saudis militarily in exchange for access to Saudi oil. So this was also the era when the West was really carving up oil resources in North Africa and in the Middle East. So all this history is in the background. And at the same time, you have the emergence of Pan-Arabism becoming a very influential ideology. And its growth is spurred by the success of Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt. And that influence filters into Libya as well. And Libya at this time, it's developing a little more, it's urbanizing. You have people moving to the cities to work in the oil sector, and they become very concerned with the fact that their oil is controlled by outside powers. So oil nationalism is also on the rise. So approaching 1969 and the coup that brings Muammar Gaddafi to power, you have in Libya an increasingly urbanized and politically conscious population influenced by Pan-Arabism and Libya's own history of anti-imperialist resistance. And then in 1969, the coup happens, what becomes referred to in Libya as the Al-Fatah Revolution, and it perfectly captures those popular sentiments. So then this leads to the question, who was Gaddafi? Where did he come from? So in 69, Gaddafi leads this free unionist officers movement in the coup against King Idris. And he's very young. He's 27 years old at the time. So he's the same age as I am. And I certainly can't imagine leading a revolutionary government of any kind. So clearly Gaddafi, from a young age, was very confident and self-assured and intelligent. And many Libyans at the time see themselves in Gaddafi. Members of his family had fought against the Italian colonizers. His grandfather was killed during the anti-Italian resistance, and he was raised on these stories of his own family's contributions to the anti-colonial resistance. He was a huge fan of Nasser. He regularly listened to Voice of the Arabs, the radio show broadcast out of Cairo, which was a show that stressed the importance of Arab unity and anti-imperialism. And like so many Libyans, Gaddafi and his family did not receive any meaningful economic benefits from independence in 1951 or from the discovery of oil later in the 1950s. So the US-backed monarchy and its friends, they enriched themselves while the majority of people in Libya suffered under neocolonialism. And when Gaddafi went to school as a child, he went to the city of Sirte for his schooling. He had to sleep in mosques because he couldn't afford a room to rent. And when he went home to visit his family, he had to either walk or hitch a ride on a donkey or a camel. So this context of economic hardship, this also politicizes Gaddafi. And when he goes to university, he becomes a political activist. And eventually he drops out to join the military and to organize a Nasser-style coup against Idris. And before that, though, in 1961, he organized a protest actually against the killing of Patrice Lumumba in the Congo. And he was also involved in attempting to organize an oil strike in 1967 in response to the Six-Day War. And he supported operations against the US-owned Wheelus Air Base in Libya. And then by 1969, Gaddafi, he's met some like-minded officers. They have created this plan to move against King Idris, and they do that in September. 1969 in an operation called Operation Jerusalem, which was a name that gestured toward their pro-Palestinian sentiments as well. And upon taking power, Gaddafi, in his first speech, he gives this really amazing statement that connected Libyans' current struggle against neocolonialism to past struggles of Libyans against foreign domination. And I have the quote here. He said, "People of Libya, your armed forces have undertaken the overthrow of the corrupt regime, the stench of which has sickened and horrified us all. By a single stroke, the Libyan military has lightened the long dark night in which the Turkish domination was followed first by Italian rule, and then by this reactionary and decadent regime, which was no more than a hotbed of extortion, faction, treachery, and treason." And very quickly, the new government, which at the time was called the Revolutionary Command Council, begins to implement policies to reverse the decades of underdevelopment that had been imposed on Libyans by outside powers. And this involves reclaiming the fertile agricultural lands that had been seized by the Italians. It involves kicking out American troops and retaking Wheelus Air Base. And perhaps most significantly, it involves nationalizing the oil, which is done in the early 1970s. And there's also this idea, especially in the West, that the Libyan government from 1969 to 2011 was a monolith, and that Gaddafi, his opinion was the only one that mattered. This isn't true. We see very quickly within the context of these revolutionary changes, rifts emerging within the Libyan leadership. You have the more revolutionary faction on the one hand, which Gaddafi is leading, and then you have the more conservative faction on the other. And this produces what is known in a lot of the histories as the Cultural Revolution in Libya in the 1970s, which ends in 77 with Gaddafi and the revolutionary faction consolidating their power, and they establish the Socialist People's Jamahiriya, or State of the Masses. And by establishing the Jamahiriya, they commit Libya to continuing and, in fact, deepening Libya's path of anti-imperialism and popular mobilization, because the people in Libya at this time are very mobilized. They've never had this level of political participation in any system before. And also, it's a commitment to a Libyan form of socialism, which is very unique to Libya, and it draws on the Green Book, which I'm sure your viewers have heard of.
Before you continue, I just want to clarify one thing. You mentioned that there was the schism and one side was conservative. By that, do you mean that it was Islamist, it was religiously oriented? And is it fair to say that Gaddafi himself was a secularist?
Gaddafi wasn't a secularist, but he wasn't an Islamist either. He viewed, I think, Islam as very important to the culture of Libya, but he certainly was not an Islamist. And I think more the debate at this time within the revolutionary leadership was about what will Libya's stance be regarding imperialism and state control of the Libyan economy. So the more conservative faction at this time was arguing that, like, yes, we've taken over control of the Libyan state, we've implemented these policies. Now's the time to normalize with the West, because if we don't, there will be conflict with the West. And Gaddafi was saying, well, if we normalize, then we're not going to be able to go as far as we want to go. So he says we need to continue investing in the Libyan military. We need to continue confronting imperialism and Israel. And he says we need state control of the Libyan economy. And some of the more conservative people in the Libyan government at this time were drawn from the merchant class, which did not want state control of the economy. So this is kind of the origin of this particular rift. Later on, I think we see more of an Islamist influence in the 2000s. At this time, though, I don't think it's a particularly influential movement, especially in the Libyan leadership.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I want to just move on from this subject. I think you've given us a very good sense of what Gaddafi's actual legacy was. And if you want to add to that, please do. But I want to, in the time available to us, address a couple of other subjects. Reports emerged after the destruction of Libya that there were slave markets. And here's in major Libyan population centers. And here is a report, widely read report from Al Jazeera at the time. And you'll see, a number of people in this image who, virtually all of them, as far as I can tell, are Black. And was it in fact the case that slave markets developed? And if so, was it the Black Libyans who were primarily trafficked in these slave markets? And please talk to us also about how Black Libyans fared under Muammar Gaddafi, and whether they were better off under Muammar Gaddafi than they were after his overthrow.
Yeah, so these slave markets, these did happen in the aftermath of Gaddafi's overthrow. I remember I had an interaction with somebody who said when they learned that there were slave markets in Libya after Gaddafi, they just said, "Well, I don't believe that." They were so propagandized against Gaddafi's Libya that they couldn't understand how things post Gaddafi could be so much worse. But in fact, this is true. We have testimonies from Africans themselves who were enslaved. The UN's organization, the International Organization of Migrants, has reported on this extensively, and it's even been reported in mainstream media like BBC or The Guardian. So I think it's established that this did become a phenomenon in post-Gaddafi Libya. And under Gaddafi's leadership, Black Africans, sub-Saharan Africans, did have a lot of opportunities within Libya because the Libyan economy was so developed compared to surrounding African countries. So a lot of sub-Saharan Africans would go to Libya for work and send money home. You see this phenomenon in many places where there is a comparatively developed country surrounded by underdeveloped countries. Oftentimes, workers will go to the developed country to work and send home money. This is what happened surrounding Libya. What we saw in 2011, as this anti-Gaddafi uprising started to begin, was that Black Africans became a target of the uprising. There was one case where, in a city called Towerga, which was a city of thousands of people, mostly Black Africans, the anti-Gaddafi uprising, this brigade from the city of Misrata, which, by the way, the Canadian military had helped to defend from Libyan government troops. The Misratan Brigade went into Towerga and they depopulated it by, according to one estimate I saw, 95%. It was ethnic cleansing. And when the Telegraph went there to report on this, they found that the Misratan Brigade had painted a slogan on the wall leading into Towerga. And the slogan said that the Misrata Brigade is the brigade for cleansing slaves and Black skin. So racism was clearly a motivating factor for a lot of the anti-Gaddafi factions that rose up in 2011. And oftentimes the accusation they would use was that Black Africans in Libya were mercenaries, that Gaddafi had hired mercenaries from sub-Saharan Africa to repress his own people. But this was reported by, I believe, Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International. I quote the organizations in my book. This was reported as not true. They couldn't find any evidence for these Black Africans who were targeted for lynching and ethnic cleansing. They couldn't find any evidence that they were mercenaries. They were Africans who had come to Libya to work or who had settled in Libya long term. So yes, definitely anti-Black racism was a huge factor of the anti-Gaddafi uprising, and this was not reported at all in Western media. And in fact, the NATO mission, Unified Protector, the leader of that mission was a Canadian, in fact, Charles Bouchard. And when he was confronted with the ethnic cleansing of Towerga, he repeated the African mercenaries accusation, which had been totally debunked. He said these people who live in Towerga aren't Libyans. They're mercenaries. They need to go home to back wherever they came from. So you had this completely baseless accusation rooted in violent anti-Black racism filtering up to the head of the NATO mission to destroy Libya. It was shocking and disgraceful. But yes.
Please talk to us about Canada's role in the destruction of Libya. I mean, obviously it supported the establishment of the no-fly zone, but in practical terms, when it actually came to carrying out NATO military operations in Libya or over Libya, what role did Canada play?
Yeah, so Canada was a significant contributor to the NATO mission to destroy Libya. And I call it a NATO mission to destroy Libya because I do think that a lot of senior figures in NATO knew that this would be the outcome. They had intelligence reports saying that if foreign powers get involved in Libya, backing one side of this war, there would be chaos and the Libyan state would collapse. And that's exactly what happened. So I do think that certainly many senior figures in NATO countries knew that this would be the outcome, and they supported that over allowing Libya to continue as this developed and sovereign and independent country on the African continent. And Canada played a significant role. They flew 10% of all the bombing runs, all NATO bombing runs against Libya. Charles Bouchard was the head of Operation Unified Protector. So this was a Canadian from Quebec who said, the Globe and Mail rather said that he signed off on every single bombing mission against Libya that NATO committed. So he was clearly very actively involved. When the UNSC Resolution 1973 was being debated at the UN and by NATO powers on their own, Canada actually took a more hawkish view than a lot of other NATO countries. Reportedly, there were some NATO countries that were uncomfortable with the idea of a no-fly zone because they knew where it was going to lead. But Canada was always very gung-ho about the no-fly zone. Canada sent Special Forces troops into Libya, Special Forces troops from Joint Task Force 2 or JTF2. This was denied at the time, but later when the government of Stephen Harper organized a victory parade in Ottawa, celebrating the Canadians who had fought against the Gaddafi government in Libya, that parade included the Canadian Special Forces flag, which was taken at the time as an admission that Canadian Special Forces had in fact been on the ground in Libya, which was a violation of the resolution that was used to justify this in the first place, because Resolution 1973 said there could not be any foreign occupation of any kind on Libyan soil. It wasn't only bombing and special forces, though. According to UNSC Resolution 1970, there was supposed to be an arms embargo on Libya, which Canada flagrantly violated. For one, Canadian forces allowed weapons to pass through the port of Misrata, which was early in the war the city that where Canada's forces were concentrated, because this was a city that had fallen to rebels early in the war. The Libyan government was trying to retake it. So Canada was there to defend the Misratan rebels from Libyan government forces. And at the port, Canada allowed weapons to go through. And this was doubly hypocritical because the ship that was there that allowed these weapons to pass into rebel hands was supposedly outside Misrata to enforce the arms embargo. And as I said, Italy, France, the Obama administration, they also provided weapons to the rebels in violation of Resolution 1970. There was also a psychological warfare component, which involved broadcasting propaganda transmissions into Libya, accusing the Libyan government of all kinds of crimes and abuses, and also violating Resolution 1973, which is kind of funny because all the NATO powers were violating it as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And again, I want to stress that under Bouchard's command, the NATO mission continuously ignored and sidelined Africans themselves who were attempting to organize a continent-led, African-led peace plan for Libya. And the African Union was very clear about this. They criticized NATO for, as they put it, misusing the resolutions that were passed at the Security Council. And in a statement that I have here, they said, quote, NATO's military campaign is significantly expanding beyond the objectives for which it was in the first place authorized, raising questions about the legality and legitimacy of the actions being carried out and the agenda being pursued. And of course, a few months later, we see the depopulation of Tuarega, which, as I said, this was committed by the Misratan Brigade, which Canada went to Libya to defend in the early months of the war. And something else that I discovered through my research was that the French jets that were part of the force that bombed Gaddafi's convoy, leading to his brutal murder at the hands of the rebels, and leading to his body and the body of his son being displayed in a walk-in refrigerator. Those French jets had been refueled for that mission by Canadian CC-150s, which are the planes that do the mid-air refueling. So Canada, in fact, had direct involvement in the killing of Gaddafi himself. And after Gaddafi's killing, Stephen Harper held this, he was the prime minister at the time, he held this big nationally televised celebration to reward those who had commanded the destruction of Libya, including Charles Bouchard. And this ceremony cost nearly $1 million in taxpayer money. And at this ceremony, Harper and the Governor General presented Bouchard with the Meritorious Service Cross, and they really praised him lavishly. And they actually claimed, somehow without laughing, that Bouchard embodied a commitment to international law. And as I said, it was at this ceremony where we saw the Special Forces flag marching in the Victory March, which was a tacit admission that Canada had, in fact, misused Resolution 1973 in order to further NATO's aim of destroying Libya. So we see from beginning to end massive Canadian involvement in this war against Libya. And I think it's also worth stating that some of the countries, the NATO countries that participated in this war, have shown some degree of, maybe not regret, but retrospection about what this war was actually for and what the impacts of it were. So Obama famously called it a shit show. Macron said earlier this year that nobody thinks what was done in Libya was a good idea anymore. And then you had in the UK, the UK parliamentary investigation into the David Cameron government and the claims and actions that it took around the Libyan war. And this parliamentary investigation was extremely critical of the David Cameron government's conduct. And it essentially laid out that all of the claims that were being made against Gaddafi in this time, that he was targeting civilians for massacres, that he was planning a genocide in Benghazi, all of these things, the UK parliamentary investigation said, actually, this wasn't true. And if this was a mission to protect civilians in Libya, then the mission would have lasted maybe a few weeks or a month. But the mission continued beyond that point into regime change, which had not been approved by the UN Security Council. This is what the UK parliamentary investigation found.
Yeah.
In Canada, there's no such retrospection about the war. There's none at all. So, for instance, when the recent tensions between the US and Canada flared up because of Donald Trump's annexationist rhetoric against Canada, Justin Trudeau, who was prime minister at the time, he went on TV and he gave a speech that sort of celebrated the Canadian and the US military's history of collaboration. And he mentioned World War II, he mentioned Korea, he mentioned Afghanistan as, shining examples of Canada's contributions to US imperialism. But he did not mention Libya because, well, I don't know why he didn't, I would guess, because there's no way to positively frame the Libyan intervention, no matter what. If anyone hears about Libya today, it's that it's a failed state and a disaster. So in Canada, there's really no efforts at all to look back in the media or in the political class on what Canada actually did in Libya.
So I'd like to suggest to you and to the audience a hypothesis for why there's virtually no introspection in Canada about this disastrous series of actions that NATO took, and why there is in Europe. And I say this as somebody who spends a good bit of time, shall we say, on the front line of this particular crisis, and that is I have a second home on the southern coast of Greece, directly to the south of our home. You can't see it given the distance, but it's Libya, the coast of Libya. And a lot of people who are fleeing the desperate circumstances of what Libya has become today try to enter Europe across the Mediterranean in rickety and very dangerous boats. And my own view is that the reason why people like Macron and the British and other European political figures today regret what NATO did to Libya is not because they particularly care about the Libyans, but because what they did to Libya has really exacerbated the migrant crisis in the Mediterranean. And that's really all they care about at the end of the day. It's not that the destruction of Libya's economy, slave markets, or any of that.
And
But
I think, and I'll just say quickly, Gaddafi warned about that at the time. He said, "What are you doing? All these sub-Saharan Africans who come to Libya for employment and for comparatively safe and stable lives, where are they going to go if you destroy Libya?" So he warned about this, and Europe is now reaping the consequences.
yeah. Now we have about 5 minutes left, Owen. I'd like to ask you about a corporation that is, in a sense, near and dear to my heart. It's SNC-Lavalin, a massive Canadian engineering firm, which I think recently was acquired and or changed its name. But in the lead up to the bombardment of Libya, this corporation, SNC-Lavalin, which is very closely tied, certainly was at that time, to the Canadian political elite. It was kind of like a national institution, even though it was in private hands. A Canadian success story, a pillar of Canada's industrial policy, had very extensive dealings in Libya with the government of Muammar Gaddafi. And I believe it was around 2010, 2011, just before this destruction of Libya began, there were revelations that SNC-Lavalin was paying bribes to Libyan government officials. And I know a lot about this personally because when these revelations emerged, the stock price of SNC-Lavalin plummeted. And at the time, I was practicing securities class actions full time, and we were retained by a couple of shareholders of SNC-Lavalin to bring a securities class action. And we filed one back in 2012. It was a $1.5 billion class action suit. It was later settled for about $110 million. So I learned quite a bit about SNC-Lavalin's dealings with the Libyan government. And it always struck me, when the destruction of Libya began and Canada was so deeply involved in it, as odd that Canada was basically participating in strangling the golden goose for SNC-Lavalin. This pillar of the Canadian industrial policy and Canadian economy lost a very, well, I would imagine that it lost a lot of lucrative business as a result of the NATO bombardment of Libya. Why do you think Canada just basically threw SNC-Lavalin under the bus by supporting this? Or do you think that they imagined that somehow the Canadian corporate class would end up profiting from all of this? And as I mentioned, we just have a couple of minutes left, so if you could briefly answer my rather long-winded question, I'd appreciate it.
For sure. And that's a very interesting question. And you did see at the time in 2011, there was clearly a disagreement between SNC-Lavalin and the Canadian government regarding Libya. You actually had SNC-Lavalin sending people to Libya to report on rebel atrocities. And this was covered in a book called SNC-Lavalin, a corporate thriller, I believe, in the French language. And I do believe that the Canadian government thought that once Gaddafi was out of power, once the Jamahiriya was dismantled, they would be able to impose a new political order in Libya that would open up the country even more to foreign investment. So SNC-Lavalin would be able to get back in there and take advantage of the contracts that it had already signed under Gaddafi. Not only that, oil companies would be able to come back because something Gaddafi was doing in the last few years of his life was some of the oil contracts that he had passed with foreign oil companies, he was talking about renationalizing them. So there was a lot of concern in the West about the security and the safety of those contracts. And I do think that the Canadian government thought they'd be able to get back in there. You had Canadian officials flying to Libya after Gaddafi's overthrow, commenting on Libya, saying things like, "We're eager to get Canadian companies back in there." They formed all these different business councils to encourage Canadian investment in Libya. So I think SNC-Lavalin would have preferred that nothing happened to Libya, that they continued to through well-placed bribes, secure these very lucrative contracts in Libya. But I think that geopolitics overtook that. The US and other NATO powers wanted Gaddafi gone, and ultimately they got what they wanted. And ironically, since the overthrow of Gaddafi, Western companies have really not been able to get back in there at all because Libya is so unstable, and there's essentially a low-level civil war still ongoing in Libya today. So I do think with the case of SNC-Lavalin in Libya, this is a company that historically has been tied very closely to the Canadian government. But the case of Libya became so relevant to the US, to NATO, to imperialism and the geopolitical sphere that actually SNC-Lavalin didn't really have a say either way.
Well, Owen, it's been a very enlightening conversation. Thank you so much for joining us. And I hope we can have you back on the Reason to Resist one day to talk about other and related developments in Northern Africa and the general depravity of Canadian foreign policy.
Absolutely. Thanks, Dimitri.
Pleasure talking to you. And we're signing off today from Montreal and Manitoba on November 21st, 2025.